You are listening to Changes Big and Small. This is Demian, your host, as we explore what makes change exhilarating. Each episode, we'll meet one person who's found freedom by embracing change. Ryan Mallone works as a classroom teacher at an international school in Prague. He loves teaching grade 4. Having lived in several countries since his early 20s, Ryan shares some fascinating experiences, such as serving in the Peace Corps and his 2 weeks silent retreats in Thailand. Listen on to find out his thoughts about change and why he thinks he can live in a cardboard box. Let's get started. Hi, Ryan.
Hi. Thank you for sitting down with me and answering my questions. I really appreciate that.
I think you've stolen my lines.
Oh.
Can you please tell us where you were born, where you live, what do you do, or how do you pay the bills?
It's a either or type of question. All right, so where I was born was Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm currently living in Prague, and I am a teacher here in Prague.
What grade level do you teach?
Oh, I teach 4th grade. It's my favorite age group to teach.
Did you always teach 4th grade?
I think I've taught every age. I started teaching undergrads and graduate students at my university in Kansas, and then I taught high school, and then I taught preschool, and then middle school and elementary school.
How long have you taught grade 4?
This is my 7th year here in Prague, and I taught grade 4 in 3 years in Nepal. So, I don't know, at least a decade.
You've already mentioned 2 different countries, Czech Republic and Nepal. Where else have you taught?
I've taught in the United States in a few places, at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, and in Seattle, Washington, at Mercer High School. And let's see, I also taught in Namibia and Senegal, Guinea-Conakry, South Korea, Thailand, Nepal, Sudan, and the Czech Republic.
Out of all of those countries, I'm going to ask that dreaded question. Which was your favorite, to see where you take it?
Favorite how?
That's a good question. Any dimension you want.
As far as what feels most like home, that would be probably Thailand. Namibia was my favorite because it was my first place that I taught overseas, and it took me a long time to figure out how to actually live abroad, I think. But I did figure it out. I think I did. So that always sticks with me. I've been in the Czech Republic the longest, so it must be something that I enjoy. There's not a particular country that I would say I did not enjoy, except possibly Sudan. But that's just because it was really hot.
You said that it took you a while to learn how to live overseas. What did you find challenging?
I think anyone that lives abroad for an extended period of time goes through a bit of a honeymoon period, and then maybe more of a reality check, and then they have to rediscover what they love about a place. And I think that it's just a process that people go through, and it's the more that you live in different areas and different cultures, the shorter that process gets. And so for me, my first time, it took me about a year to kind of figure it out, to fall out of and then back into love with the place that I was in.
One of the things that I notice is that when visitors come to visit me in Prague, or when I lived in Japan, it really helps me rediscover what I love about a place, just watching their reactions and how they interact with the environment. What helps you become comfortable or acclimated to a new place?
It's probably changed. I can be pretty comfortable in just about any environment now, but I would agree with you. I think when I had my family come visit me, or my parents come visit me in Namibia, it definitely made me see a lot of things for the first time, even though I'd been there for a long time. And I think I really appreciated it a lot more through the lens of showing people around and exploring it together.
Namibia was your first place that you lived outside of the US. What brought you to Namibia?
When I first started higher education, I started as a computer scientist. So I did my undergrad work in computer science, and while I was doing that, I was also doing internships and co-ops. And so I worked for Boeing in Wichita for a summer, and I worked at a startup and a medium-sized company, a tech company in Kansas City. And I loved learning about computer science, and I was not in love with working in the field of computer science. I was thinking a lot about that as I was going through and closing out my undergraduate degree and what I would want to do next. And I got a pamphlet in the mail asking if I wanted to consider the Peace Corps, and I absolutely did. At the time, I was working on fixing different office databases and doing all sorts of boring computer science things and in the corporate arena of Kansas City. And I had the comparison in my mind already that the flood of fluorescent lights and the sea of cubicles didn't really change, and I was in the corporate American version of the heart of darkness. And I thought, well, why not just do the real thing? I was already teaching at the university. I was teaching some math classes and some computer programming classes, and I was also teaching some computer programming classes at the job that I was at, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And I thought that a good challenge would be to try to teach in a completely different environment. I had already had some experience with teaching in it and liked it a lot, and so that was all really what I needed. I just needed that catalyst of, hey, this is a possibility. You don't have to work a 9-to-5 job after you graduate if you don't want to, and I definitely did not want to, so I did that instead.
Let's go back to when you got that flyer in the mail. What was the journey that you took besides being dissatisfied with your corporate job? What else went through your head to help you make the decision to move to a country thousands of miles away?
Probably a few things. I recognized the possibilities of not necessarily conforming to a particular path when you're young, and so I figured I can try that at that age. This was in 1998, 1997, and so actually, I'll step back a little bit. I'm from Kansas, and I am kind of an armchair critic with current events and things that are happening in the news, and I did not want to be like that. I did not want to have my world experience be just in the United States. It didn't feel right. It didn't fit me right. It wasn't a big leap for me to say that this was going to be my next step. It seemed very natural for me to do that.
How did you prepare yourself for the move?
Well, the nice thing about Peace Corps is that they take a lot of the responsibility for preparing you. I didn't have to worry about housing. I didn't have to worry about language training. They did all that for me. I just had to show up. The only type of preparation is the mental preparation, and that's probably just understanding that you're going to be in an environment that's going to be a little bit more isolating than what you're used to. I don't know if you can prepare for that. You just have to experience it, and you either get over that hump or you can't, and I think I was able to.
How long did you stay in Namibia, and what helped you last?
I only stayed in Namibia for about a year and a half. Normally Peace Corps contracts are for 2 years, but I was on the Angolan border, and Angola was ending a 26-year civil war, and the UNITO rebels were being squeezed hard by the government at that time, and to stay alive, they were doing cross-border raids into Namibia and raiding towns, and a couple of French tourists got killed while they were traveling in the Caprivi Strip, which is that little strip of land in northern Namibia. And that panicked Washington, D.C., and they said any volunteer that lives in the 5-kilometer range on the border needs to leave. And so I didn't have a choice in the matter, but I had to go. And I could have relocated somewhere else in Namibia, but I felt I was a little bit robbed because I was just figuring out, after about a year, how to live there and be happy. And I was planning on staying longer than my 2-year contract. And I also felt that I let the school down because with a lot of third world countries, you go through these series of exams. And if you don't pass an exam at, let's say, when you're in 10th grade, a lot of times the education kind of stops. You can repeat the year, but a lot of children end up not repeating. And that's where your education ends. And so I was the math and science teacher for grade 8, 9, and 10. And at the beginning of the year, because it's in the Southern Hemisphere, the year starts in January, and I left in February. They were pretty much without a math and science teacher. I'm sure they were able to find someone, but I just felt that it would be a disservice to the school if I was able just to relocate to a different school in the country. I didn't want to do that, so I just reapplied. I reapplied for the Peace Corps again, and that's what let me go to Guinea in West Africa. And so then I did that for 2 years, a full 2-year cycle.
How long did you spend in the Peace Corps overall?
Almost 4 years.
I imagine that participating or volunteering in the Peace Corps is a particular kind of lifestyle. It's not something that I've done before, but the way I know Ryan is that we worked together at the same school in Sudan. Sudan isn't exactly the easiest place to live. In fact, a few minutes ago, we heard Ryan say that maybe it was one of the least favorite of his places because of the weather. What did you do when you left the Peace Corps?
My process that ended up leading me to Prague was a series of revelations. And my first revelation was that, there are schools outside the US that actually pay money for English speakers to teach at. And that was great. So, because I wasn't a trained teacher, I didn't have a teaching certificate or anything. And so I'm like, well, I want to keep doing this. And so I went home and I moved to Seattle. I lived there for about a year while I was waiting for a particular job to open up in South Korea. So that was the big realization, is that, there's schools outside of the US that will pay you to teach even if you don't have a teaching certificate. And a few years later, I realized, there's something called an international school, where if you have a teaching certificate, you don't have to teach in the US. You can teach at these other schools, and they actually pay a little bit better.
You've made a lot of different changes in your life. You've mentioned many places that you've lived. What would you say was the biggest change that you've made?
The biggest change that I made? I don't know, probably the first one, I guess. Although it didn't seem more like necessarily a change. It was just like, okay, so what am I going to do next? I never really changed my lifestyle. Right? As an adult, I've always lived overseas. All right, so to back up a little bit, when I was in Guinea, I ate pretty much the same meal every day for 2 years. When I was in Sudan, I did something similar. I ate at an Ethiopian restaurant and ordered the same thing every day. I don't really think of myself as someone who experiments a lot with change. I'm perfectly comfortable doing the same thing all the time. I don't have any aspirations above being a classroom teacher. I love being in the classroom, and I don't know what I would do if I was not a classroom teacher. So in that respect, I don't see myself as actually an agent of change. In fact, I am so comfortable with any type of living that if there was a zombie apocalypse, I would not be the one that could figure out how to booby trap the house and to build a shelter. I would be fine in a cardboard box. I'm sure of that. Because I would not be motivated enough to go beyond that. In fact, I feel like in some respects it's kind of hurt me because I don't feel like I'm a functioning adult. I mean, I just said I was fine living in a cardboard box. So I can't be a functioning adult. There's some basic things I don't understand probably about living in the US because I've never done it, or at least I haven't for an extended period of time.
One of the reasons that I wanted to talk to Ryan is because I think he's an extraordinary classroom teacher. He does an excellent job of building relationships with his students. There are clear boundaries that help them learn, while also giving them a lot of freedom for them to discover who they are. I want to push back a little bit on what Ryan said, on what you said about not really being an agent of change. I think that there are people who just personify a particular way of being to the extent that they don't even realize how powerful it might be. When Ryan and I worked together, he was one of the teachers that would always kind of push the boundaries, and I'm sure he continues to do that, of what education can look like, what teaching and learning can look like. I think that's one way that somebody can actually be a change agent. It doesn't have to be big and dramatic, but it's challenging the status quo to some extent. So for example, it's, I don't have to follow this set path that people say is the right way to be successful. I don't have to teach in that way that the people before me taught, or even my professors have taught me to teach, because there are actual people in my classroom who I care about, and I want to make sure that they're meeting their capabilities. Additionally, Ryan didn't have to move from place to place. Sure, maybe he was forced out of Namibia, but since then, he's intentionally made some changes in terms of places that he's lived. So maybe you eat the same meal every night for dinner. I don't know, but you've been intentional about making some changes. At what point do you decide to move to a different country? Or at what point do you decide to change your practice? What drives you to make those changes?
I've been here in Prague longer than I thought that I would be. I had a pattern of every 2 or 3 years I would move on. I broke that pattern when I was here. I think because it's just such a nice place to live. It's a very pretty city. But that has to be some of it, but probably not all of it. I probably got too comfortable. I get itchy feet, I guess. I got itchy feet in Nepal. That's I wanted to. I love being in Kathmandu, but 3 years seemed like enough.
How do you think that initial move to Namibia set the course of your life? Or what was the impact of that initial move on the course of your life?
I left for Namibia when I was 22 or 23, and then that 2-year contract ended up being 4 years. So I missed the point where you're supposed to figure out how to be an adult in the US. And so I just kept on avoiding a reality that I don't really understand.
Many people may have an idea that they want to find a similar course, that they want to experience working or living in other places. What advice would you have?
I think I alluded to it before, is that wherever you decide to move, or whatever life you decide, there's going to be a variable honeymoon period, and then it'll be the opposite. you'll notice things that bug you more than they probably should. But finding a happy medium between those two extremes, I think, is important.
Do you have any concrete suggestions? What are some things that you might do to find that happy medium?
My concrete suggestions are through the lens of how I started, and that was really just through service and volunteering. And I think I'll go back a little bit to, this isn't quite answering your question, but it's making me think about this. When I first started in Namibia, we were a group of about 60 people, 60 Americans that were being trained for different things. And through one of our meetups, we were talking about what brought us here, and someone had said, I came here because I wanted to help the people of Africa. And my eyes just rolled so far back inside my head that I probably could see my brain. But the idea that you go somewhere because you think that it's a one-way service, I think, is a huge mistake. Whenever I think about service work, and I think this is what Peace Corps kind of teaches you, and that it's been reinforced by other work that I've done, is that it's the wrong way to do it if you think that I am going to be the giver and you are going to be the receiver. In fact, the only way I think that you can look at it is it's about forming relationships. If you could look at it through that lens, that when you move somewhere, when you go somewhere, it's about the relationships that you make. That's the only thing that ends up being meaningful, I think. That doesn't answer your question, but I've just been thinking about that a lot.
The idea of relationships being important for dealing with change or for addressing change has actually come up a few times.
And maybe that's another reason why I probably didn't like Sudan that much, is because I wasn't good at making relationships in that particular culture. And so it doesn't feel like I could ever break through, I guess. I didn't have strong relationships outside of some of the teachers that I was working with. And I think that just happens. I think some cultures, it's if you wear them as skins or clothes or whatever, some fit and some don't for you.
I'm going to extend what Ryan said and kind of suggest that if you try something and it doesn't work out, let's say you visit a new country and it doesn't work out, that doesn't mean that you're not suited for travel or that you're not suited for living in a new place. It might just mean that you haven't found the right fit. And I know that definitely has been the case for me. I have enjoyed all the countries I've lived in, but I don't feel that anywhere has fit like a second skin. But I also feel that you could make anywhere into a home if you have the correct attitude. If somebody is thinking of joining the Peace Corps, what should they consider? What advice would you have for them?
I think it's changed a lot. I think now with digital devices, the experience probably has changed. For me, the best thing about it was that I lived in environments that didn't have electricity. It didn't make any sense to have any electronic devices. I had a shortwave radio to listen to the news. But the reason that was the best thing about it is because I learned how to be bored. And I think learning how to be bored is an amazing skill. And it brought out all sorts of creativity spurts that I didn't think that I had. That would be my advice, is if you can figure out how to learn how to be bored, it's actually a wonderful, wonderful thing.
For anyone who feels that they may not be prepared for living a life overseas or for moving from the US, what might they do to get prepared?
I don't know. What would you say? I mean, if you're not prepared, then you probably don't really want to do it.
I think that if you think that you're not prepared to go on a trip or to move overseas, investigate. What is it that's holding you back? If you know what it is that's holding you back, then you're actually able to come up with some strategies for addressing those concerns directly.
A couple of times in Thailand, I went to this Wat, which is the Thailand temple, and took a vow of silence and just meditated for 2 weeks. Man, your brain really, or my brain, really just kind of revolted with that. I had the craziest dreams during that time when I wasn't allowed to talk, and all I could do was try to think about just follow my breath into my chest and then back out for days on end. It's a really hard skill too, to be comfortable with yourself. Your brain really doesn't want to do that very easily.
So when you did that, you didn't speak for 2 weeks to anybody?
No.
Did you live at the what in that time frame?
Yeah, so this was in southern Thailand, but yes, so you're supposed to sleep on on a slab of concrete. I think I brought a towel to sleep on because that would just kill my back. But and then you had to do a couple chores, so you sweep the walkway or whatever. But you start each morning at 5 o'clock in the morning with some silent yoga exercises, and then you either sit meditate or you walk meditate for the rest of the day. And there's one meal you eat at 11:30 in the morning, and then I think you're allowed to have tea or milk tea at 5 o'clock at night. But yeah, you're pretty much just in silence by yourself. And it opens you up to all sorts of brainwashing because the monks are allowed to talk and they will talk to you about Buddhism, but you're not allowed to say anything. It was great though.
How many times did you do this?
I only did it twice.
Only. What did you learn from that experience? Just like what I said, that your brain fights, that kind of calmness. It really, really wants to think about stuff that's happened in the past and worries and troubles and stuff that's going to happen later in the future. Just having that time to just kind of push it down and to make sure that you don't do that. It actually ended up being really energizing, which is why I did it more than once. What inspired you to do this?
It sounded really neat. Doesn't it sound neat to not talk for 2 weeks?
I'm not sure that it sounds neat. I've heard several people mention this. Tim Ferriss has talked about it on his podcast and had people who also talked about it. And Tara Brach also talks about doing silent retreats. I feel like I can be by myself for a long time, but just knowing that you can't talk will make you want to talk all the time.
It was really interesting. So this is different than being bored with yourself, right? So because all you're trying to do is to quiet the storm in your mind, which takes a lot of work. And so I was never bored with that. It's hard to remember now. This was a decade ago, but I think in the beginning I did have that need to talk. But like with anything, you form that habit of not doing it. And so I remember the first time I left the retreat and I was allowed to talk. I probably was talking to a taxi driver, asking them to take me to the town to go to the next town or whatever. And I remember just speaking for the first time and I had tears going down my eyes because I did not want to talk anymore. It was just such a fascinating feeling that talking would actually make me tear up.
I'm so curious about your experience with this. Do you think that there's anything that you learned from those 2 silent retreats that carries into your life now?
I would like that to be. It felt really good. I wasn't the only foreigner that did this, right? This was supposed to be for foreigners that wanted to kind of recharge their batteries. And a lot of people came because they were taking a break from work and they felt that they needed to re-energize their batteries. And I think to the T, it really helped a lot of people just kind of feel good about themselves again. And that's, I think that's the benefit of meditation in general, but I don't always make the time or the space to actually do that as much as I should. I wish I did, but I don't.
When you don't know how to do something, or when you're faced with a challenge, what's your approach to learning the skills that you need?
I think it would depend. After Namibia, the reason why I wanted to go to Guinea, to go to West Africa, is because I said to myself, okay, so I've taught overseas, all right, and this was I don't know, my 20s bucket list or whatever. And now I guess my next step is I want to try to teach in a different language. And Guinea is very much a francophone country. There's not much English in the country at all, especially where I was. So it seemed like a natural next step for me. So I spent a few months learning French, and then I spent the next 2 years trying to teach in French. And so my lesson plans, I would meticulously craft them by candlelight the night before and make sure I had the right script and everything. But the reason I didn't stay there for longer than 2 years is because I never felt that I knew enough conversational French to form those relationships that I was talking about earlier. I had good friends there, but language was always a barrier. And I really tried. I mean, I was surrounded by French for 2 years, and I plateaued, and I could never get over that hump. And language in general for me is really, really hard. Every country after that, I've spent a little bit less time with the language because it's just an incredibly difficult task for me for whatever reason. To the point where I've been here for 6 years now in Prague, and I don't know Czech at all. I don't have to. It's really easy to get around speaking English, but I would say that I have utterly failed at that type of challenge. Whereas if I want to, figure something out that's not language-based, try to read as much about it as possible, I suppose.
Although you didn't say this directly, it sounds to me that if you're faced with a challenge, one of the modes that you go into is planning mode. I tend to find that I can have more spontaneity when I feel comfortable with the knowledge space, when I know what to do, how to do it. For example, when I first became a teacher, I wrote out meticulous lesson plans, even if I was teaching in my mother tongue, because I was not confident yet. And so I feel that when I'm not sure what to do, I plan.
Yeah, that's funny. I guess that's right. When even now, I need to get to school a couple hours before school starts so that I can plan it out a little bit. I've always been that way. But at the same time, I hate planning like a day or a week in advance. I'm not very good with that. It has to be timely, I guess, for me.
It sounds like another advice we might give listeners is find out what works for you. Once you find out what works for you, you can kind of put that into motion to help you achieve whatever you're curious about or whatever new things you might want to try. Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Sure.
It's been a great conversation. Ryan's blog is aimed at his classroom. If you'd like to connect with him, please comment on this podcast either in your podcast app or in the show notes. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Changes Big and Small. For more great episodes like this one, don't forget to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app. This will let you automatically download new episodes every week. I leave you with this final thought. What are the opportunities open to you that are just waiting for you to notice them?